This week on Security Weekly, Lee Holmes joins us from Microsoft to talk PowerShell and other things. Joff's going to do a tech segment that's going to involve some venom, so make sure you stay tuned for that. And Stories of the Week, we'll talk about the big vulnerability that really wasn't that big. All that and more, so stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Security Weekly is brought to you by Black Hills Information Security, the leaders in penetration testing and active defense. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to request a quote today. The SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security training, certification, and research. Visit SANS.org to explore the full curriculum and latest training offerings. Onapsis, the leading provider of solutions to protect ERP systems from cyber attacks. Customers can secure their SAP and Oracle business-critical platforms from espionage, sabotage, and financial fraud risks. Visit them on the web at onapsis.com. Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, the Pwn Phone, and the Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com. Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. Very excited, as always, to be here this week. It is, in fact, I think it's April 14th. It's been that kind of a day. It is April 14th, and I'm joined by a cast of characters on Skype. Mr. Jack Daniel is here with us. Welcome, Jack.
Good to be with you, as always.
Mr. Joff Thayer is here with us as well. Welcome, Joff.
G'day, Paul. How are you? It's good to be here. All right, lovely Thursday evening.
All the way from Puerto Rico, it's Mr. Carlos Perez. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Paul. Happy to be here.
And our very special guest is here with us, too, due to technical difficulties where you guys are all on the Skype machine. You kind of look like one row of the Brady Bunch, which is awesome. Lee Holmes joins us from Microsoft. Lee, welcome to the show.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
It's going fantastic. Now, Lee, I'm told you are the lead security architect of Microsoft's Enterprise Cloud Group, covering Windows Server, Azure Stack, System Center, Operations Management Suite, and you're also one of the authors of the Windows PowerShell Cookbook, as well as an original member of the PowerShell development team.
You got it. It'd be nice if it was a couple authors on the PowerShell Cookbook. It was just moi.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yep.
That's one big book.
Nice. So, Lee, how did you? I usually ask your guests, how do you get started in information security? Is security your focus, or more on the operation side?
I've been involved in security. Hearing you guys tell your stories about the BBS days and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of how I got into security, like everybody else is kind of checking out the edges of it. And that's how things started. When I came to Microsoft, I worked for this little website called Encarta. I don't know if you guys remember that.
I remember Encarta. That was their encyclopedia thing?
Yeah, exactly. So I worked for Encarta, and they have a CD product, and then they had the website. So I was part of the website aspect of it all. And as part of that, there was, if you came in to Encarta from the CD product, you got a deluxe view, or if you came in from a search result, you got a deluxe view. And so I did the security architecture for that to kind of figure out who gets what. And then after a while, I went off and there was this news on Slashdot, and it was about this crazy new C# based shell that Microsoft was making. And I happened to be at Microsoft at the time, and I was like, this sounds really interesting. I need to check it out. And so I started doing some digging around, and it was called Monad at the time, and it's become PowerShell since then. It was in a super, super early beta at the time. If you wanted to clear the screen, you just had to hold down the Enter key long enough for all that crap to flow away from what you could see. So, so it was really early, and from my security background, I got involved in all of the security stuff in PowerShell, and that kind of became a big passion of mine. Working on PowerShell, I did a lot of the security stuff there, so the eventing stuff and the transaction stuff. And that naturally grew to other stuff inside of Windows and Windows Server, and helping other teams understand kind of their security stance, and helping them design what's the right security and the right mitigations for attacks that they're worried about. So it's been a really exciting ride. It's an amazing industry, right? We never stop learning, never stop having fun. It's really lighthearted. It's every time you go to a conference, you learn something new and just have a great old time. So I'm enjoying it.
And Ellie, was it frustrating at any point for you to look at the PowerShell adoption and have worked on creating this really cool thing, and not many people are using it at one point in time?
Frustration isn't the right word.
Outrage?
Murderous tendencies.
Yeah.
No. I don't know if the architect of PowerShell is Jeffrey Snover, and he was always super, super laser focused on. There's a great book called Crossing the Chasm, and it talks about how every technology and everything goes through the early adopters and the fast followers, and then there becomes a part where that tends to drop off. But then at some point, if you build enough bridges and enough things that will lead you to mass adoption, and really think about that carefully, that has a much, much higher chance of coming. And so as PowerShell was starting off, we absolutely knew that there were some rough edges that we wanted to work on. We knew there were some adoption blockers we wanted to work on. But we just really kept persistent on simplifying things, making it so that the early knowledge that people got was able to extend into more advanced skills. A really, really big stage of it is that no technology is good just for that technology sense. So PowerShell started off as people who got into it, who got to love it. It was life changing for them. Like for me, it was literally career changing. Seeing those early betas and then realizing the power that it was about to unleash. But most people aren't of that sort of internal nature. And so once we started shipping tons and tons and tons of PowerShell commands in Windows Server, that's when it was actually helping people get their jobs done, even if they didn't care about PowerShell as a technology. It just made their lives better.
But now, the flip side of that, there's kind of a double-edged sword for PowerShell. Attackers are adopting this technology as well as information technology and security professionals, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way I like to think about it is, so the first thing is that there has never been a PowerShell attack where PowerShell was the compromise. Everything that uses PowerShell is a sort of a post-breach, post-compromise thing. So what you've got is somebody has double-clicked a malicious attachment that got code running, or somebody was compromised via phished credentials, or somebody's been compromised some other way, right? So an attacker already has code running on the system, and then they have their choice of what technologies they're going to use to extend that breach. So now if you put yourself in the shoes of an attacker, you got a couple options. You've got assembly language, you've got C++, you've got VB script, and none of that stuff leads itself to job satisfaction. Then you've got PowerShell, which has got a great scripting language. It's fun to use, it's powerful, it's pithy, and attackers have great taste in tools, just like anybody else does, and that's what we see them gravitating towards.
Now, wait, Lee, you say that PowerShell is fun to use. Which components inside PowerShell, in your opinion, make it fun to use?
I think about this frequently. I've been on the team since before version 1. So PowerShell is getting around its 10-year anniversary right now. So we're talking about a decade and more of PowerShell. Now, you would have thought that the honeymoon phase would wear off after a little while. You get in, start working on the project, and it's like, this was really fun, and then you go off and discover something new. But even still, every day when I use PowerShell, there'll be something that just blows my mind about how easy it was to express a desire of mine. And so I've got, in terms of like lines of code written, I've got more experience in C#. PowerShell is written primarily in C#, but I much less often have this thought of like, this is mind blowing. I could not believe how easy this was. In PowerShell, that happens all the time. Just for an example, I was doing some, you hear about people who are bragging about vulnerabilities and what they found and stuff, and maybe they get a CV out of it. I did a search on the Microsoft, the TechNet site. Microsoft does a good job of acknowledging all the researchers that help with responsible disclosure in the things that are patched. It's a great old table. I used literally a PowerShell one-liner to scrape through that table on the web page, find all the researchers that were credited, group them by researcher, and figure out who were the top researchers reporting issues to Microsoft last year. And it was like literally a one-line thing. And there's some people who are so humble up there that are posting 20 to 30 issues and reporting them to Microsoft and helping secure everybody together. But they don't go around tooting their own horns. They just produce. They just ship. They just work.
So Lee, for those of us listening that are in an IT role or IT security role, what are some of the features of PowerShell or like tips and techniques that you have for people who are trying to secure and harden systems? How can they best take advantage of PowerShell to secure their environment and protect their systems?
That's a great question. So I guess there's two aspects to it. One of the things that truly surprised me the most is that when it comes to the rise of PowerShell, is that IT administrators have latched onto it very, very quickly, especially because it helps them get their job done so quickly. What surprised me the most, actually, was that the security research and tooling community didn't latch onto it quicker, and not the the attacker side of things, but the people who just love to sit there and they go, I use all my tools on Unix or Linux. I want to still have some of that power on Windows. I was surprised that more people weren't writing PowerShell analysis and toolkits and everything else. So that stuff has really started to increase now. So there's now PowerShell modules. So what I'm talking about now are the people who want to use PowerShell to secure their own systems. So PowerShell has a ton of remote capabilities. You can go off and scan thousands and thousands of machines very, very quickly, simultaneously, for maybe hey, I found this interesting indicative compromise on my system. When I see this thing, I think there might be some bad news coming my way. You can very easily scan all your machines remotely for that issue or that vulnerability or maybe that misconfiguration.
Yeah, and that point right there, Lee, makes it very unique in my mind when I liken that to a Linux environment. And in Linux, we have Bash. And PowerShell, to me, seems so much more than Bash. It seems more like a Ruby or a Python, except it's so tightly coupled into the operating system that it offers those features and functionality. So in the Linux world, we need Bash, we need something like Python, and then we need something like Ansible or Puppet or Chef to really replicate what it sounds like you're describing in PowerShell.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we have an enormous amount of respect for the Unix ecosystem. I think it's completely wrong to position it as PowerShell versus Unix. Most of us on the team come from a strong Unix background, and not just Unix, but like DEC and VMS, because nothing is invented in a bubble. And we really, what you'll notice is a lot of the things in the PowerShell language, in terms of dynamic scoping and variable identifiers and things like that, those tend to look like popular scripting languages, like Perl or whatever.
No, wait, I didn't mention Perl. Just for the record, you mentioned Perl. I wasn't going there.
Yeah, it's been the language that tons and tons of people cut their teeth on. And the Bruce Payette, he's the principal language designer behind the PowerShell language. Along with Jim Truer, they both spent a lot of time working on it. Now, the language capabilities, they don't just come from just something in a vat that we decided and discovered. It comes from, hey, this was really successful in this language. Maybe this would be a good thing to incorporate into PowerShell. Or this was really successful otherwise. The one thing that I think makes PowerShell very unique is that we really worked to make the learning curve in PowerShell a very gradual curve. Now, what you run into often with separate tools like you have with like Bash and Python and whatever else is that you run into, like, you're doing some automation at the command line, you start putting together a pretty interesting Bash script, and then at some point you're like, I would really love a hash table right about now, or something else, like some other programming idiom or technique, or I'd like to interop with some of the bigger frameworks.
Or
so then you go
do math, for example.
Yeah, right. So you get into one of these situations, and what that's generally meant is throw away what you've got so far, and then go off and write it again in Python or something else.
I've been there. It's a very accurate description. Yep.
And then there's the opposite situation where how, like, maybe Python or C# is going to just rock at doing something, but you don't want to create another little console app, or you want to integrate some bits of programming with some bits of the things that are natural in a shell. So a perfect example, when somebody starts writing a systems management tool, you nearly always end up doing some sort of file system recursion. And the person coming from C# or some other kind of language will then have to write their own recursion utilities and then do whatever. All that stuff's just built into PowerShell. So you can do and it's also built into Bash, right? Just recursing through files. So you can so easily merge the system management concepts with the programming concepts, and then it just ends up flowing so easily from beginning to end. So that's the kind of thing that really makes it easy for people who are doing securing their systems using PowerShell. It just gives immense access to the frameworks and the operating system primitives and everything else.
Carlos, I want to turn over to you, being our resident and actually one of the security community's resident experts in PowerShell, and have you ask some questions of Lee.
Yeah. In fact, I have 3 questions. Let's start with the first one. Many times I get the question, I know kind of the answers, but I want to get them from you. It is, how do I defend myself from the PowerShell attacks that have been out there? For example, Carbon Black with their report, which is, in my opinion, a bit questionable. Some of their figures have mentioned, hey, the sky is falling, PowerShell's being used by attackers. It's being abused by them. How can we secure from the most common types of attacks that we're seeing right now from PowerShell? And what is Microsoft working on to make it even more secure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you see some reports like this, it's really useful to step back and take a look at just the industry as a whole. So Microsoft every year releases the Security Intelligence Report that talks about all the different strains of malware and everything that's out there. And what you see are tens of thousands of strains of malware out there. Like I was mentioning before, PowerShell is always a post-compromise thing. So the attacker has already somehow compromised the machine, and then they're just deciding are they going to use to further their attacks, right?
A macro, an HTA.
Yeah, exactly, right? So somebody's double-clicked a Word document with a macro in it that has some VBA in it. So at that point, you're running VBA that can literally do anything that you could do on the system. And then they decide, this sucks, I'm going to use PowerShell. So from that perspective, when people start to ask, how do you block PowerShell attacks? It's important to step back and go, well, why do you only want to stop PowerShell attacks? Don't you want to stop your macro attacks or your C++ attacks or your assembly language attacks? And so what we see sometimes happen is that people will kind of go to the end of, I like to call it like the Maslow's hierarchy of security controls. They'll be worried about these maybe these forensically clean attacks that leave no disk footprint and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have forensic capability. They don't look at their disks. They don't analyze their images. Maybe they don't have antivirus installed. They don't do any sort of auditing. By the time, if they completely block PowerShell attacks, they're going to have a really poor return on investment. What it's best to do is follow standard security hygiene and best practices and start with doing things like deploying app blocker you start with audit mode, set a baseline of what you think is running in your system, start paying attention to things that are new. When you've got some success with that, then start doing some application whitelisting. Then start working at, when you've got all these defenses, what you see malware will sometimes do is go off and disable your audit controls. If you're not auditing those themselves, you've got another blind spot. Because, if you went through and decided to block all PowerShell attacks or all VB script attacks, and an attacker is just disabling those controls, you've got a big blind spot. So, when people are talking about solving PowerShell attacks, I think it really makes sense to start with like just good hygiene. It's hard work. Honestly, it's hard work. There's a natural gravitation towards easy fixes.
Yeah.
The truth is that easy fixes don't exist, otherwise the security industry wouldn't exist. It would have been solved 10, 15 years ago, and we wouldn't be talking about anything right now.
Yeah, and you hit one very important point. It is many people are focusing at the end, but many times when for example, when I do my class for my customers on PowerShell for security professionals, I cover both threat and blue side. And when I cover the red side, I always tell them, okay, this is how you use PowerShell in attack. So typically I go with them and go, here's how you build a macro that will launch PowerShell. This is how you build an HTA file that will launch PowerShell. This is how you grab some C# code and create an executable that will execute PowerShell. So there's always something else ahead of it in the kill chain that will execute PowerShell at the end. And many times people just go like, we need to block PowerShell, and go like, do you have control on your macros? No. Okay. Do you have control on Windows scripting host? No. Okay. Do you have AV? No. Okay. Then you have a lot of stuff before you get there.
Right. Really, the state of the art right now is that for most people, they can just write a custom application that does their thing, right? They either recompile mimikatz or they write something from scratch. And unless you've got a mature system and a mature organization that's watching for these kind of things, then it doesn't really matter what you're doing at this like really high level in the Maslow's hierarchy of security controls. But at the same point, I do say that this is a very important thing, that people trying to block PowerShell attacks should absolutely make sure they're focusing on fundamentals. Microsoft in the industry has been preaching this stuff forever. At the same time, we're on the PowerShell team and Microsoft, Windows Server, we're absolutely aware of the reality that people are also using PowerShell as part of their techniques. We'd be remiss if we just said, you know what, just focus on the other stuff. We're going to turn our backs. The PowerShell team and the Windows Server team has known that PowerShell is a super powerful language, super attractive since the beginning. And we've been working since the very beginning to make sure that it is as security transparent as possible. And so you don't run into situations where you've just got a bunch of like random PowerShell running on your systems and you don't know what's happening. In version 1, we introduced command logging, so you can just turn on command logging and see every command that PowerShell is running. We made that a lot easier and a lot more easier to deploy in version 2 and version 3 with group policy settings and things like that. And also in version 4 and version 5, we cranked this up like really to the next level. We added system-wide transcripting. So any host that launches that uses the PowerShell engine, you get the equivalent of an over-the-shoulder style transcript. So whether this is a custom application hosting the PowerShell engine, or whether it's PowerShell itself, anything that uses PowerShell, if you configure this globally, you'll get to see the inputs and outputs of that invocation.
Yep.
Now, sometimes some of the inputs and outputs are kind of under the covers. So you'll see something like a stager that what you see is them running a stager, and then it runs off, pulls something down from Pastebin that has other malware, and then it goes...
GitHub.
Yeah, GitHub in the case of half of the malware out there.
Yeah.
Pulls these things down and does that in memory. So what we also added was script block logging. So the script block is the smallest chunk of code that PowerShell understands. And every time PowerShell sees one of those, if you turn on script block logging, it will also log that to the PowerShell operational channel. So you can write all kinds of crazy intelligence on the PowerShell commands that are actually being run, no matter how many stages of kind of Russian dolls they're going through and obfuscation and whatever else. One thing that I'm super impressed with is in Windows 10, we worked with the anti-malware team to make something called the anti-malware scan interface. So anti-malware has generally, AV engines, they generally detect malware when it's being read off of disk. And so it's a file on disk. They capture a process, loading it up, do a bunch of scans on that file and detect whether it's bad. That's not so helpful when you've got things that attackers are generally obfuscating that initial payload enough so that a file-based scan doesn't help. And then they go off and they fetch new things from the internet, and then they use some sort of dynamic evaluation. So in PowerShell, that might be the invoke expression commandlet. In VBScript or JScript is eval, those kind of things. So in Windows 10, all the scripting engines in Windows have been updated so that when they're asked to do one of these dynamic invocations, they send that also to the AV engine for scanning. So this is an open interface. Every AV vendor can subscribe to it, and that makes any sort of signature-based approaches to malware so much more effective, because you can then target the actual payload as opposed to any of these like mildly obfuscated wrappers that they tend to distribute.
And as you mentioned, it's not only PowerShell. It's also Windows scripting host with its family of JScript and BBScript and WSH script, and all of those are also sent over to the engine, and they get sent to the engine deobfuscated. So when you obfuscate all of your code and you add a lot of wrappers, what the engine's going to see is the actual code after it removes all of those wrappers that people tend to put around it to bypass AV and other stuff. So they're getting that raw final version of the code before it executes. It goes into the engine, gets detected. I remember one time chatting with you as it was catching invoked Mimikatz and it was catching other stuff in our box. I remember it happened before one of my classes as I was prepping the demos. I was going like, what are all of these red lines here in screen, and why is it catching this? And then you illuminated me to ANSI and everything about it.
Yeah, we've been finding that the signatures, the anti-malware scan interface-based signatures are a lot more stable in terms of catching variants than the ones that are based on the initial context.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and also shifting a bit over from PowerShell, you also work security on cloud and Azure and all of that stuff. So one of the things that I've been noticing is that Microsoft right now is shifting and maturing in terms of security. For example, I was looking the other day at a bunch of the different tools that the Azure team is putting out on the cloud side. And when we work with cloud, it's a bit more difficult to do security itself because you don't own that infrastructure. And Microsoft has been providing a lot of behavioral tools. Do you know a bit about that? Where right now, for example, Azure right now is even measuring if I connected to a server, how long did it took me, would have taken me to fly somewhere else, and it will alert on that. Also starts going through certain behaviors. It builds kind of a pattern of my actions and then starts reporting on those.
Yeah, I think that's we're naturally in a place right now where, as an industry, people who are involved in security feel that security through the perception of control. And so they just love to just mess around in the registry and like tweak all these D words, and that's just what makes us feel like we're having success as a security engineer or a defender. What's becoming really, really obvious is that degree of control, especially a successful amount of control that way, is not being that effective for a lot of people. So there's what they think that they're doing for security, they're still getting owned. They're also investing a ton of their effort in securing stuff that it's like, I don't really care about these servers that are running this thing. I just want my email. And so I think that's where we're seeing a big change, is that when you can start to centralize some of these activities, these actions into the cloud, for one thing, the cloud providers, they can generally do a much, much better job of securing their infrastructure than, let's say a million customers trying to do that equivalent thing. And so I think we're seeing a really unique change here in security where people can start getting themselves a lot more secure, not by becoming better bit twiddlers, but by making like architectural decisions and strategic decisions to send some of this stuff into the cloud or start using another provided solution there.
Yeah, Lee, I think that's an excellent point on cloud that I haven't heard us talk about on the show in quite some time. Your insights into that, I think, are awesome. My question for you is, what does the Azure cloud, like, how does that differ in terms of security and management, which go hand in hand? I think when we talk about cloud, like, how does that differ from the other cloud platforms? And I speak with a lot of people who are like on all ends of the spectrum. They're like, I want to build my own cloud because I don't trust the cloud. Or, I started with Rackspace and I went to Amazon and, in all these different cloud providers. Like, what does Azure provide that is kind of like the selling points, but in terms of security and management?
That's a pretty big discussion, and there's other people who I think are. I think Mark Rasinovich has done a couple great presentations on what are the kind of controls you get for Azure security. The one thing I would point out is that what we tend to see is that people will be very cautious of the cloud. So a great example is coming out of the enterprise cloud group. I mentioned that there's the cloud platform system, and also we're working on a thing called Azure Stack. And these are really exciting to me. So cloud platform system is taking basically the system center private cloud approach to building your own private cloud. So using VMM and System Center and Hyper-V and all that kind of stuff. We've, for a long time, had a do-it-yourself guide. It was hundreds and hundreds of pages, and people had a hard time setting that stuff up. So what we've built is the cloud platform system that lets you basically buy these things pre-configured, pre-tested. So that gives you the opportunity to really start feeling what it's like to start doing platform as a service, as opposed to like really just twiddling all these bits all the time and worrying about, did I deploy IIS correctly? Instead, you just start talking about Azure websites.
Right.
Now, what we were also offering, and we're working on it right now, we've got a technical preview out, and Jeffrey Snover also gave it was a recorded build presentation of just talking about Azure Stack, and that's a great one to look at also. There's a really unique opportunity there because the goal with Azure Stack is to offer Azure consistent platform. So the infrastructure itself is going to be based on things that are more natural for an on-premise scale. But in terms of the compute resources and the storage resources and things like Azure websites and all that kind of stuff that you begin to expect coming out of Azure, our goal is to bring those things into Azure Stack itself so that you can consume those resources from an on-premise cloud, the same thing that you would when it's in the public cloud. And I think what we're seeing is people say, I really love this experience. I thought I was going to hate it. I love it. Now I realize that this big expenditure that I've got on hardware and maintenance and operation, I think I'd prefer that the experts at Microsoft instead do that hosting for me, and then they can move it right up into the public Azure and have a much quicker conversion process than they would have with just a regular sort of on-premise deployment.
No, I agree. Any other questions for Lee? Closing questions for Lee before we get to the 5 questions.
No, I think you should go straight to the 5 questions.
5 questions. Lee, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Ready as I can ever be.
3 words to describe yourself.
InfoSec thought leadershipper.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
If I was to be known as a serial killer, I wouldn't want to be a successful one, so I'd say a Nerf gun.
That's good. That's a unique answer. If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
How would this one?
There you go. Windows PowerShell Cookbook. Very nice. Very nice. In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
It depends who's playing.
Okay, well, the following question is how you define your team, but that's acceptable. There's no right or wrong answers to these questions, by the way. Lee, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
I would have to say, for my dad, maybe Wayne Gretzky. He's a pretty awesome hockey player.
Oh, that's right, you're Canadian, eh?
Yeah, absolutely, eh? And for my mom, maybe like Grace Hopper. That'd be pretty cool to be like having your mom inventing half of computer science.
Awesome. Lee, thank you so much for appearing on Security Weekly. It was wonderful having you. Make sure you check out the Windows PowerShell Cookbook. And Lee, do you have a website you want to take people to?
Oh, sure. leeholmes.com/blog.
There you go.
And also my Twitter is cool.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lee.
All right. Thanks, guys.
With that, we're going to take a short break. Come back with a fabulous technical segment from our very own resident expert, Joff Thayer.